The courtroom was heavy with tension, but not the respectful kind that usually surrounds such a place of law. Instead, it carried a mocking undercurrent, a cruel energy that whispered through the benches like smoke. Every creak of the wooden seats, every stifled laugh, every sideways glance seemed to build upon itself, creating an atmosphere of arrogance and ridicule. At the center of this storm was a man who should have commanded respect the moment he stepped through the doors, a decorated black army general. His posture was straight, his eyes unyielding, and his uniform carried the weight of service, sacrifice, and honor. Yet, here he was, standing in a courtroom that did not see his worth. They did not see the medals pinned to his chest or the years of service carved into his soul. They only saw the color of his skin, and to them, that was enough reason to sneer. The cop leaned back in his chair, smirking as though he were watching some cheap comedy. His laughter wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, sharp enough to cut through the air and pierce the dignity of the man before him. The sound carried a message, that in this room, in this system, the uniform the general once wore meant little. He was no longer the man who had led soldiers into danger, who had faced the weight of command, who had stood on foreign soil defending the very freedoms that allowed this cop to sit so smugly today. To the officer, he was just another black man in court, and that was enough to diminish him. The arrogance was contagious. A few muffled chuckles rose from the back benches, followed by murmurs that danced on the edges of disrespect. The judge shifted but did not intervene, his silence almost like an endorsement of the behavior. The general stood still, refusing to let the laughter or whispers sway him. He knew this battlefield well, though it was not fought with weapons and uniforms but with prejudice and power. His silence was not weakness, it was the calm before the storm, the kind of quiet that unsettles those who expect their target to crumble. The cop's eyes glistened with amusement, as if daring the general to break character, to react in anger, to confirm the stereotype he already believed. The room seemed to lean into the moment, hungry for humiliation, eager to watch dignity falter. Every detail of the courtroom added to the cruel spectacle. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a pale glow that seemed to spotlight the general's isolation. The wood-paneled walls carried the weight of years of judgments, but today they echoed only mockery. The shuffle of papers on the clerk's desk, the tapping of pens, the barely hidden smirks among spectators all painted a picture of a place where justice was being replaced by arrogance. It wasn't a trial, it was a stage, and the general had been unwillingly cast as the subject of ridicule. But even as the atmosphere thickened with condescension, the general's presence did not shrink. His shoulders remained squared, his gaze forward, his silence unbroken. Every laugh directed at him became a reflection of those who mocked, not of the man himself. The energy in the room, though hostile, could not strip him of his history, his accomplishments, or his identity. It was arrogance layered upon ignorance, a courtroom blinded by its own assumptions. The cop shifted again, his laughter softening into a grin, as though savoring the moment of superiority. The judge's lack of intervention made it clear, in this space, the mockery was not just tolerated, it was permitted. And with every second that passed, the atmosphere grew thicker, heavier, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The general stood in that courtroom, surrounded by whispers and laughter, but not once did his face betray the weight of insult pressing down on him. Where another man might have shifted uncomfortably, looked down at the floor, or lashed out in anger, he did none of those things. Instead, he remained calm, his posture straight, his eyes steady, as if every mocking glance and every smirk rolling through the room simply slid off him. It was not pride for pride's sake. It was the dignity of a man who had endured worse storms, who had marched through deserts and jungles, who had carried both the burden of leadership and the pain of sacrifice. He had stood before enemies who wished to see him broken, and if he had not bent then, he would not bend now. His silence was not surrender but strategy, and his calmness was a shield that no ridicule could pierce. The cop, smirking as if he had already won some invisible battle, seemed to misinterpret the general's composure. To him, the lack of reaction meant weakness. He leaned back with a smug grin, tapping his fingers as though the courtroom were his private theater. But the general's stillness carried a quiet power, the kind of control that does not announce itself but makes its presence undeniable. Each second he stood unshaken was another reminder that this was a man trained not only to lead but to endure, to absorb insult without letting it dictate his actions. His calm was unnerving to those who wished to see him break. The spectators fed on the mockery, waiting for him to stumble, waiting for the moment when his composure would crack and give them something to confirm their biases. Yet the longer he held his ground, the more uneasy the silence beneath the laughter became. His dignity turned into a mirror, forcing each cruel smirk to reflect back on the one who wore it. He was teaching them, without a word, what it meant to hold on to respect when surrounded by contempt. Every person in that courtroom had expected a different reaction. They expected anger, shouting, maybe even a loss of control. But what they saw instead was a man rooted in discipline, a man who did not flinch in the face of mockery. The general's eyes did not wander or lower. They remained forward, sharp yet calm, carrying the weight of someone who had looked death in the eye more than once and had lived to tell about it. To him, the laughter in this room was small compared to the roar of battlefield chaos, compared to the nights he had spent writing letters to families who had lost their sons under his command. He carried those memories with him, and they steadied him now. That calmness was born not of ignorance but of experience, forged in fire and polished by sacrifice. He knew who he was, and no courtroom whisper could erase it. Even the way he breathed carried intention. Steady, measured, never rushed, as though each inhale drew strength and each exhale released the weight of insult. His body was still, but his silence spoke louder than words could. It said, "You cannot define me." It said, "Your laughter does not change my truth." It said, "My value was earned in blood and honor, not in the shallow judgments cast in this room." His calmness was not just a personal shield but a silent rebuke to every person watching, a challenge to reconsider the ease with which they had dismissed him. The cop's grin lingered, but there was a flicker of uncertainty beneath it. He had expected his mockery to land, to provoke, to humiliate. Instead, he was met with an unshakable wall of composure. It was as though the general's calmness swallowed the room, forcing everyone to notice it even if they didn't want to. The laughter felt thinner now, less certain, because it clashed against a presence that refused to bend. The general's silence created a tension, an unspoken question that hovered in the air: what kind of man absorbs insult this way and still stands tall? The answer was in the way he carried himself. His calm was not passive but active, a decision made with every heartbeat. It was the kind of calmness that belongs to someone who knows the power of patience, who understands that true strength does not always roar but sometimes whispers. His dignified response became the most powerful act in the room, more cutting than anger, more lasting than words. The courtroom had tried to strip him of respect, but instead, his composure made their cruelty look small, petty, and desperate. His calm presence was a reminder that respect cannot be taken from a man who refuses to let it go. The moment the general reached for his phone, the air in the courtroom shifted, though most didn't realize it at first. To the untrained eye, it looked like a simple gesture, a man pulling out a device as anyone else might. But there was something deliberate about the way he did it, something precise in the way his hand moved. It wasn't frantic or desperate, it was calm, assured, practiced. He scrolled with the ease of a man who knew exactly what he was about to do. Those who laughed moments before kept their smirks, unaware that the tide was turning, that history often pivots on small, quiet actions like this. The phone was not just a piece of technology in his hand, it was a key, and he was about to unlock a reality that none of them had been prepared to face. The cop's grin widened, thinking this was yet another sign of weakness, a desperate attempt to call for help, a pitiful effort to seek validation. He leaned closer to the person next to him, whispering with a smirk that stretched across his face, as though mocking even the act of making a call. The judge shifted in his chair but still said nothing, uninterested in stopping the spectacle. The spectators watched with idle curiosity, unaware of the significance that was about to unfold. Yet the general's expression never wavered. His thumb pressed a name, one that carried more weight than the entire courtroom combined. The ring on the other end was not just a sound, it was the slow drumbeat of change, the kind of rhythm that brings silence where there was once arrogance. The phone call was brief in its beginning. A low, respectful tone carried through as soon as the line was answered. The general's voice did not raise, did not strain, it was steady, almost casual, as though he were speaking to an equal, not someone to be begged or persuaded. That calmness in his voice contrasted so sharply with the mockery surrounding him that it created a ripple of unease. He was not a man scrambling for support. He was a man reminding the room of who he really was, of the connections and authority that could not be erased by prejudice. Every second of that call seemed to chip away at the arrogance that had filled the room moments before. The general's words were few, precise, and deliberate, but the tone was unmistakable. He was speaking to someone powerful, someone who respected him, someone whose recognition alone was enough to shift the balance of power in that courtroom. The cop's grin faltered, just slightly at first, but enough to reveal the beginnings of doubt. His eyes narrowed, searching for clues, trying to piece together what was happening. The judge straightened in his chair, suddenly aware that this was not the harmless act he had assumed it to be. The spectators leaned forward, sensing that something important was unfolding, though they still didn't understand the magnitude. The general lowered his voice, not in secrecy but in confidence, the kind of tone that tells listeners they are hearing only what he chooses to reveal. Every pause, every measured word added to the gravity of the moment. It wasn't the call itself that held power, it was the man making it, the authority behind his presence, the recognition in the voice on the other end. The general's calmness on the phone was the ultimate contrast to the chaos of mockery that had filled the room minutes before. As the conversation continued, it became impossible to ignore the subtle changes in the courtroom. The laughter had faded into whispers, and the whispers into silence. Even those who had been most eager to ridicule him now sat in uncomfortable stillness, realizing that something greater than them was being set into motion. The general didn't need to explain or raise his voice. The act of making that one call was enough to unravel the smug confidence that had dominated the room. Every tick of the clock during that call was a reminder that they had underestimated him, that they had mistaken silence for weakness and composure for defeat. When he finally ended the call, it wasn't with the desperation of a man pleading for help but with the finality of someone who had just shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. He placed the phone back in his pocket with the same calm precision he had shown when taking it out, as if the call had been nothing more than a routine action. But the effect lingered, heavy in the air, impossible to ignore. The general had made his move, and though no one yet knew exactly what it would bring, the certainty of change was undeniable. The courtroom was no longer laughing. The silence that followed was thick with unease, the weight of realization pressing down on every smirk that had dared to rise against him. The officer who had been laughing moments earlier leaned forward in his chair, the grin on his face still present but weaker now, as though he were trying to convince himself it belonged there. The general, standing tall and composed, had revealed a fraction of who he truly was. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but that calm demeanor and that single phone call had begun to pull back the veil that concealed his true identity. For so long, the people in that room had looked at him and seen only what they wanted to see, a black man in court, another face to dismiss, another life to mock. They had no idea that the man standing silently before them had spent decades wearing stars on his shoulders, carrying the burden of leadership that few could even imagine. The cop's mockery now seemed misplaced, almost fragile, though he still clung to it like a shield. He did not understand the weight of the uniform this man had once worn, the responsibility of leading soldiers into battle, of making decisions that carried life and death in their balance. To him, it was easier to believe that the general's silence was weakness, easier to mock than to confront the possibility that he had insulted someone whose authority eclipsed his own. But the truth has a way of breaking through arrogance, and in that courtroom, it was about to shatter the illusion. The general's true rank was not just a title. It was the embodiment of years of service, of loyalty to a nation that often failed to return the same loyalty to him. It meant discipline, sacrifice, honor, and the scars that came with all of it. It meant that when he spoke, people listened, not because they feared him but because he had earned their respect with every choice he made in uniform. That truth lingered in the air like a storm gathering, unseen but undeniable. The cop had mocked a man who had commanded thousands, who had the ear of leaders far above the courtroom's walls, who had been entrusted with decisions that could alter history. And now, as pieces of that identity revealed themselves, the arrogance in the room began to crumble. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair, a flicker of realization passing across his face. He, too, had treated this man with dismissal, failing to see beyond the surface. The general's composure, his dignity, and that single act of making a call were forcing the truth into the open. The spectators, who had once leaned into their curiosity with smirks, were now leaning forward with unease. They could sense it too, that there was something far greater about this man than they had assumed. The laughter they once shared now felt out of place, shameful even, though none of them dared to admit it aloud. The general remained silent, allowing the weight of who he was to seep into the cracks of their arrogance. He didn't need to announce his rank or demand their respect. His identity carried itself, and slowly, it began to command the room. The cop, still clinging to his smirk, found his confidence faltering. The image of the man before him no longer fit the narrative he had built in his head. He had mocked what he did not understand, and now that truth was unraveling before his eyes. The revelation of rank was more than just a detail, it was a reckoning. It exposed the shallow prejudice that had driven their laughter and forced them to confront the reality that they had mocked not just a man, but a leader, a warrior, a protector of the very freedoms they took for granted. His rank was not a weapon, but it cut sharper than any insult hurled against him. It reminded them that respect is not given by those who mock, it is earned by those who serve, and this man had served more than most could comprehend. The courtroom felt smaller now, suffocated by the presence of truth. Every uniform he had worn, every command he had given, every soldier who had followed him, all of it echoed in that silence. The cop's smirk was a shadow of what it had been, his arrogance thinning under the weight of realization. For the first time, the imbalance of power in the room shifted, tilting away from the officer who thought he owned it and toward the man who had quietly held it all along. The general's true rank had been revealed, not in loud declarations, but in the undeniable shift. The officer's laugh had been loudest at the start, ringing through the courtroom with arrogance and disdain. He thought himself untouchable, thought the badge on his chest gave him authority that could not be questioned. To him, mocking a black general was nothing more than an easy display of superiority, a way to flex his power in front of the judge and the spectators who shared his prejudice. His grin carried the smugness of a man who believed he was in control of the room, and every chuckle seemed to feed his ego. But arrogance is fragile, and in that courtroom, it was about to shatter. What began as laughter was soon replaced with uncertainty, then doubt, and finally the one thing he had never expected, regret. The general did not meet arrogance with anger. He did not raise his voice, did not strike back with words meant to cut. Instead, he held his silence, and then he made that call. A simple act, calm and deliberate, but heavy with meaning. In that moment, the officer's smirk began to falter. He had no idea who was on the other end of that line, but something in the general's demeanor told him it was someone whose authority eclipsed his own. His laughter, once so confident, now felt hollow. He sat straighter, trying to mask the sudden unease creeping up inside him. The spectators noticed it too, their whispers softening, their curiosity deepening. The energy in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The regret did not strike all at once. At first, the officer tried to brush it off, tried to convince himself that the phone call meant nothing. He told himself this man couldn't possibly be who he claimed to be, that the idea of him being a true army general was just a story, an exaggeration. But as the minutes passed and the weight of silence filled the courtroom, denial became harder to cling to. The general's composure never wavered, his authority never in question. It wasn't about proving himself, it was about letting the truth speak louder than any insult hurled his way. And the truth was settling into the officer's chest like a stone. Every smirk he had given, every mocking glance, every laugh now echoed back in his own mind, but they sounded different this time. They weren't triumphant or confident, they were ugly, cruel, small. He could feel the weight of them pressing down, each one a reminder of how carelessly he had treated a man who had earned respect with blood and sacrifice. Regret is a powerful thing because it doesn't just remind you of what you've done, it forces you to see yourself as you truly are. And for the officer, that reflection was not flattering. The spectators who had once shared in his mockery now shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their eyes, others crossed their arms, as though trying to distance themselves from the behavior they had encouraged moments before. But the general did not need to point fingers or call anyone out. The silence he created was enough. It exposed them all, stripped away the veneer of arrogance, and left them staring at their own shame. The officer, however, bore the heaviest burden. His voice had been the loudest, his mockery the boldest, and now his regret the deepest. He realized, too late, that he had not been mocking just a man. He had mocked years of service, mocked the sacrifices of soldiers who had followed this general into battle, mocked the families who had waited for their loved ones to come home. He had mocked the weight of medals earned, the scars unseen, the quiet nights spent making decisions that most men could never imagine. And now, as the reality of that truth sank in, his laughter seemed monstrous even to himself. What had once felt like control now felt like shame. The general didn't need to retaliate. He didn't need to raise his voice or expose the officer's arrogance. The regret was punishment enough, heavier than any words could deliver. In that courtroom, the officer's smirk was gone, replaced by tight lips and restless hands that betrayed the turmoil inside. He had mocked a man greater than himself, and now he could feel the full weight of that mistake pressing down on him, suffocating the confidence he once wore so easily. The higher authority the general called upon wasn't just a person on the other end of the line, it was the authority of truth, of respect, of honor that no badge or gavel could diminish. And against that authority, the officer was powerless. The silence that followed the general's phone call was unlike any silence the courtroom had known before. A space that had moments earlier been filled with laughter, smirks, and whispered mockery was now thick with unease. It was the kind of silence that presses down on the chest, that makes every small movement feel amplified, that forces people to confront what they had tried so hard to ignore. The general had not shouted, he had not demanded respect, he had not even raised his voice. All he had done was stand with dignity, make one deliberate phone call, and allow the weight of his truth to settle over the room. And now, every person present could feel it. The cop who had mocked him the loudest sat rigid, his earlier arrogance evaporated. The smug grin he once wore so proudly was gone, replaced by a clenched jaw and darting eyes that betrayed the regret building inside him. He did not dare laugh again. He did not even dare to speak. He knew now that the man he had mocked was not powerless, not someone to dismiss. The authority on the other end of that phone call had confirmed it, though the general had revealed little with words. It was his composure, his calm assurance, his refusal to bow under insult that carried the truth louder than any explanation could. And that truth silenced the room. The judge, too, shifted in his seat, his earlier indifference exposed. He had watched the mocking unfold, had let the officer laugh and the spectators snicker without interruption. But now, the weight of the general's presence forced him into discomfort. He could feel the eyes in the room shifting, the collective realization dawning on everyone that they had underestimated the man who stood before them. The general's silence was no longer interpreted as weakness. It was understood for what it truly was, strength. And with that understanding came a deep and unsettling shame that hung heavy over the courtroom. The spectators, once so quick to join in the atmosphere of ridicule, now sat quietly, each of them battling their own unease. Some stared at the floor, unwilling to meet the general's eyes. Others watched him carefully, as if hoping to glimpse more of the man they had failed to recognize. They did not whisper now. They did not smirk. The silence they sat in was not comfortable but waited, each second dragging on longer than the last. It was the silence of realization, the silence that comes when truth strips away pretense and forces people to see themselves clearly. The general, for his part, did nothing more than stand in the same calm composure he had carried all along. His shoulders remained straight, his face serene, his presence commanding. He had not needed to prove himself with grand gestures or declarations. He had not needed to remind them of the medals, the rank, the years of service. His truth was undeniable, and it had revealed itself in the simplest of ways, through dignity held in the face of mockery and through one call that carried weight beyond the walls of the courtroom. His silence now was not emptiness, it was authority. It was the kind of silence that demands respect without asking for it. The cop could feel it most of all. His laughter, once sharp and cutting, now echoed in his memory like a curse. He replayed it in his head, each chuckle sounding uglier, each smirk feeling heavier. He had mocked a man far greater than himself, and now he sat in the wreckage of that arrogance, unable to take back the sound of his own voice. The regret burned quietly in his chest, and though he would never admit it aloud, the silence made it unbearable. Every passing moment pressed the weight of his mistake deeper, until he could no longer hide behind bravado. The courtroom itself seemed transformed. The air felt different, denser, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the shift. What had started as a scene of ridicule had turned into a lesson carved in silence. The general had exposed not just the prejudice of individuals, but the fragility of arrogance, the ease with which it crumbles when faced with dignity and truth. Those present would carry the memory of that moment long after they left, the silence, the shame, the realization that they had laughed at a man whose very presence should have commanded their respect. It was not the phone call alone that silenced them. It was not the revelation of his rank or the weight of his connections. It was the combination of all of it, the calm dignity he carried, the authority that could not be mocked, and the undeniable truth that prejudice had blinded them to who he really was. The silence in that courtroom was not just the absence of sound. It was the presence of truth, heavy and undeniable, pressing down on every person who had dared to laugh.